So welcome. I received an email today or yesterday. I don't know if it had been from this class or from the other county, asking what we are doing and how it is linked to economics. On the one hand, it's not linked, it's not directly linked, meaning it's a completely different course. On the other hand, I think this is one of the most crucial issues, and this had been mentioned in the email as a kind of question. How does it actually link to economics? And the answer given by the writer is something, is it about asking why we are actually doing it and how we are approaching economics? You have here a definition of ethics, moral philosophy, which seems to be far away from any calculations and formula of economics. As you know, last weekend something happened in Paris, which had been in the news. This had been widely discussed and widely distributed. Something happened more or less at the same time in Beirut. More or less nobody talked about this. Whenever I followed the news over the weekend, most of it was sensational. It was about fear. It was about emergency, and it had been more about personal impressions. And it had been racist. I can understand all these reactions. I lived in Paris. I am confronted with migration. I'm myself migrating. I have fear, and I do not know if I have so much fear as Bangor, the Pope, who said this is the beginning of it, or maybe the beginning of the Third World War. In any case, we are facing a serious situation which goes much beyond what we are talking about when it comes to individual personal feeling that, or what happened, involvement, what happened in Paris and in Beirut. There happened something in January this year. I was sitting in a beautiful palace in Rome, which is the French embassy, and I was thinking about nothing. I was studying. In the embassy they have a beautiful library, and I was kind of distant to what happens in reality in everyday's life, if you want, doing my academic work in the most beautiful palace of that country that is usually linked to the revolution of this system in which we live today. As I said, it's the most beautiful palace. It is a kind of representation of these values we usually connotate with our modern times, whatever these modern times are. It is a place that has this overview of Rome, and it is a place to study. It's always a pleasure actually to be there and facing this wealth of literature. And it is something where, when I left this building, was confronted at the end with another riot in Paris against Charlie. It's a newspaper, it's a journal, a satirical journal. Again, people have been killed, or already people have been killed. Not as many as now, But it is an ongoing confrontation, and for a special reason, I do not want to use the term war. This term war had been used several times, not only by Bangor, but by Pope Francis, but as well by Hollande, the French Prime Minister. It had been mentioned in terms of we will have a harsh reaction to what happened. Which I can understand, as I said. At the same time, we always or we usually forget what the background is. I think it happened in 2005, when there was another riot, when there was another violent act in Paris, usually connotated with the term banlieues. The periphery of the city, where those people live without any hope, where those people live who are, by this economic system of France, excluded of this society. If you ever go to these banlieues, if you see that the concentration of migrants is extremely high, that you have an extremely high unemployment rate, if you see that you have in many European countries now a youth unemployment rate of 40+%, you may have an idea of what I'm talking about. These people, foreigners or not, do not have any hope for their future. There's another thing we usually forget when it comes to this cruelty of what happened over the weekend, or just at the weekend. It is a kind of, and there I use the term, it's a kind of global war. This war is about hegemony. This war is about using power to control raw material, in particular oil. And it is about defending these resources. It's absolutely the wrong means, but we have to face the situation. And when we talk about economics, or when we talked about economics, I mentioned a couple of times externalities. This is exactly what happens on this scale. It is about the production of externalities, shifting everything away and trying to keep whatever we have. The means that are used are cruel. The means do not have any justification. At the same time, we, as academics or as students, face this challenge of analyzing and of a kind of soberly approaching what is going on there. As I said, this is a moral question or ethical question to think about what is right and what is wrong. Whatever we do in economics, it is exactly this question: to think before we act, to think before we apply any formula, and to think what is wrong, what is right. And it is not about the what is wrong, what are we doing in this moment, but it is as well about what is there in terms of the consequences, in terms of the impact that our action has. In terms of values, if you want, in terms of what kind of society are we actually building, and how can we get to something that is just or whatsoever. It is about applying a certain methodology. And this learning skills course is very much about applying a methodology. Remy is here again today with us, and he has the ungrateful job of looking this week through referencing, through bibliographies and plagiarism. This is part, if you believe it or not, it's part of exactly these ethical values. We don't steal anything, we don't grab anything, but we make the reference in positive and negative terms, if you want. We are acting in this tension between individual responsibility and social setting. This means as well we are always, or at least very often, acting in a field of tensions. I highlighted this one tension between individual and social. And in which way ever we are always part of something and are acting in this social context. Even sitting in such a beautiful library, we are part of something. Actually, there we are part of history. If you are sitting in this building or feel you are part really of this long history. But there are other tensions. I mentioned some tensions which I think are of core importance. Ideal and material. We can think about the cruelty of what happened, but we have to think as well about the material conditions under which these people had been growing up. The conditions under which these people live. It is not a justification, but it is something that is actually mentioned at the end, measurement and understanding. We can see, we can count how many people are involved in terrorism or you name it. But it does not mean much as long as we do not understand the reasons behind it, as long as we do not understand it as part of a historical process. It is about abstract and concrete. And I had been thinking, actually, when I made this slide, where should I put the abstract and where the concrete? As individuals, we are actually very abstract, because we are kind of detached from everything. I have had last time this quote from the preface of the political economy. We are part of social beings, of social settings. We are part of our nation states. We are part of our groups, of peer groups, students, whatsoever. This makes us being concrete. This makes us as well being active. Otherwise, we are kind of passively perceiving something. There is one and the most difficult challenge. We can talk about law, but if you study law, you will always face this difficulty of, is it just? There's a huge difference, or possibly a huge difference, between justice and law. You can apply simply a law, which does not mean much when it comes to justice. A law itself may be highly unjust. It is difficult to understand it, but it is simply a fact. If you study a little bit law, you will immediately come across this. When I studied law, I remember the first session, actually the first course, the first seminar session, where it was as well something 1.5 hours, and the prof said, "No, listen, this is the case, and we have to give a legal answer to this." And then he went through the different laws, through the different paragraphs, and said, "Okay, consequence, the judgment, guilty." And he listed exactly what it was about. Break, not for you now. And then we came back and discussed the second half. This was the mainstream argument. We can look at it from another angle. And he took the same case, different laws, the same laws, different articles and paragraphs, and came to the completely different conclusion. Law can be bended. The question for you, the question for this learning skills course is, can justice be bended as well? A quote from the 18th Grammar of Louis Bonaparte: "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already. Given and transmitted from the past, the tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living." You can have this quote at a later stage and go through it. And this is something most important when it comes to learning what we are doing and to the methodology, meaning the question, why do we do it and why do we do it in this way? It is the question, where are we standing in history? China 2015 as part of a global order. And it is something where we are changing basically permanently these conditions. I want to take you again today, last time in a way, back to, in this case, 1533. History doesn't repeat itself, but there is something that happened at this stage, and we talked about it. And if you look at this painting, you will soon see what I'm referring to. It's a painting by Holbein, a Flemish painter, as I said, 1533. The title of the painting is The Ambassadors. Left from you is the French ambassador to England. On the right, it is a bishop, and he had been, amongst others, French ambassador to the Pope, the Holy See. This is the one dimension, the two ambassadors, one country and other countries, globalization if you want, and one country to this highest value definer, if you want, the Pope, Catholic Church. As you know from last time, this system actually crumbled away and was under threat. Reformation, all these changes. Something we see in not the same way, but we see many parallels today. Are we talking about values, Christian values or whatsoever, or are we talking about immediate economic interests? If you look at the painting in detail, you see exactly this presented. You have the celestial globe on the top. You have many instruments actually to measure the heaven, and the heaven was always seen as the place where God is, or where Christianity finds its roots. And you find, on the other hand, the terrestrial globe on the bottom, and you find other instruments, and you find a musical instrument. I don't want to go too much into details, because one of the strings actually is broken, which means this was the thread of the time, really, where you could see the living of people was affected, the way of daily life was affected. As I said, I don't want to go, and I cannot go through detail. There's so much in this painting. There is something that is remarkable, perhaps because we don't know what it is. I'll come back to this later. Perhaps you have an idea what it could be. Before going to this, I want to come to somebody. I said the left ambassador was the ambassador to England, and the English king was Henry VIII at the time, as well portrayed by Holbein, 1491 to 1547. And he did something very interesting. And sometimes details matter. Retrospectively, funny details. Henry had a problem. His wife didn't give him a male offspring. A female offspring was impossible, was unacceptable as queen. So, in his thinking, or in general, it had been said it's the woman who cannot give birth to a female being. So there was, in this perspective, only one solution to it, and the solution was divorce. But Catholic Church said divorce isn't possible. And then he said, but if you do not allow me to divorce, I divorce from you, meaning from the Catholic Church. And since then he was actually, and the English kings are still, or had been up to recently, the head of the Church of England, not of Ireland, of England. So it was a separation from the Church, a separation from the prevailing values. Now there are many things to be said about this. At this stage, first and foremost, simply the power. And if you want the random character of history, to some extent, that somebody decides we will change the world because of this question of hiring. We need the king. Now this is surely not the entire story. This is the story of the little thing I showed you before. This. As I said, and this is methodology as well, never trust what you see. Don't know why this never works, but
The world is full of hidden world. Sometimes being able to see them is just a matter of looking things from the right way. Consider, for instance, this mysterious painting and that strange white blob at the bottom. But if you walk around the painting and stand in just the right spot, the blob is transformed and reveals itself to be the image of a human skull. So this little bit of optical magic is called anamorphosis. From the Greek word that means to form again. The idea is that we start with an image or form started appearing in the early 1500s, pretty much as soon as the rules of perspective were discovered. But there's really no question that the most famous, and definitely the most bizarre example of an anamorphic projection is this painting, The Ambassadors by Hans Holbein. Now, this episode's going to be extra special, because I'm going to present here, in this video, a totally new finding. Something that, if I'm correct, will finally answer questions about this painting that's gone unanswered for 500 years. And that is, I'm going to demonstrate precisely how the skull was made, and from precisely where the skull is meant to be used. Okay, so I think this is all pretty exciting. So let's just jump right in. The first thing I did was to write a little computer program that simulates how the painting would look viewed from any location. I did this using MATLAB, and that's also why I made the animations that you see. And I realized it would be mostly hopeless trying to get the technical details here, so I put a full explanation of all my steps on my website, idolsofthecave.com, which, of course, I encourage you to visit. Anyways, once I got the program working, I started playing around with various ways of looking at the painting. And one interpretation I read, which I really liked, was that the character on the left here, Jean de Longueville, who was the French ambassador to England when he commissioned the painting, wanted it to be hung in a specific room in his chateau back in France. And this room had two doors, one at the back and one off to the right. So if you entered from the first doorway, you'd be looking at the painting head on. But the second doorway would place you, and maybe it would be a total surprise, at just the right position to confront the skull. And the skull here is a memento mori, a reminder that, regardless of our earthly attainments, death awaits us all. So I really liked this story, and because of it, I expected that the correct eye level for viewing the skull would be the same as for viewing the main portrait, since why should the viewer have to crouch or jump as they walk from one part of the room to the other? Well, it's easy to find eye level for the portrait. We can just look at the horizontal surfaces and see that it has to be somewhere in this band. Unfortunately, though, it turns out this is all wrong. From this height, no matter what else you do, the skull's going to look, well, pretty lumpy. So, reluctantly, I had to abandon this premise, and after a period of trying lots of options, I finally accepted that you get the best-looking skulls when the eye's positioned about halfway up the painting. Now, there's something really significant halfway up the painting, except for the fact that it's halfway up. So I ended up taking this as an assumption. That is, I'm assuming this is no accident, and that, in fact, the correct eye level for viewing the skull is at the exact vertical midpoint of the painting. Now, as far as making handsome skulls go, this is definitely progress. But more importantly, it's a vital clue in deciphering how the skull was drawn in the first place. Because it means we can eliminate the possibility that Holbein painted using some method of direct projection, say, for instance, by mapping out key points and strings. Instead, the fact that the best eye level for viewing the skull has no justification in the context of the painting's visual content, but a really good justification in terms of the painting's physical dimensions, indicates that Holbein almost certainly made the skull using some sort of grid transformation, in particular, one that maps squares into trapezoids. Now at this point, all I've managed to do is reach the same conclusion the National Gallery in London arrived at in their analysis of the painting. But we can go further than they did, because I believe we can reconstruct Holbein's trapezoid grid exactly. First off, we don't need to speculate about how these grids were made. You can find explicit instructions in several books from roughly the same time period, including one by our old friend, Athanasius Kircher. And after staring at the transformation long enough, and comparing it to the painting, it's almost as if Holbein didn't even bother to hide the grid lines that he used. We already have the center line, which is eye level for viewing the skull, but there's another line too, and here I'm referring to the really striking and perfectly geometric line made by the skull's jawbone. If we trace this line out, it will intersect the center line at a point which, in Kircher's notation, is called S. And this is the first of 2 points we need to uniquely determine the trapezoid grid, the other being point O. The idea here is that points S and O would have been used by Holbein to make the anamorphic projection of the skull we see in the painting. Therefore, in order to get back to the original skull, all we need to do is locate point O and perform the inverse transformation.
I'll leave it with this. You probably did not understand all the calculations. The point is, there is something we possibly don't even recognize at the first instance. We may think there is something wrong. It doesn't really fit. The second impression may be he was a good painter, a well-known painter. He wouldn't do anything without any consideration. And then there comes this consideration of we have to look what is behind it. Now, as I said in an earlier lecture, we have some knowledge from somewhere that in this case would actually allow us to go to look from the side and say, perhaps it is one of these anamorphic sculpts or anamorphic paintings. That's the name of it. Meaning you basically turn something in this way around that it looks differently from different perspectives. And I mentioned a couple of times the importance of perspective. Methodology is very much about the question, which perspective do we take? What is our interest? What is the question behind it? What do we want to achieve? In economics, is it efficiency? Is it equity? Is it long-term growth? Is it short-term profit? Whatever. Anything of this can be easily calculated. At the end of the day, it's easy to calculate this. What is more difficult is to understand where do we want to go. I mentioned in this one slide something like last principles. You can say there are last principles, or first principles, pardon. First principles. We can say there are first principles and we cannot really explain anything. This is what is explaining everything. But then we see justice would be one of these first principles. And there is no thing as justice. There is no thing like justice where we can say this is ultimately just. If we go back in history, those people who bought slaves thought this is just. If you look at gender issues today, many people think it's just that women do not earn the same as men. In Europe, we have about 60–70% inequality in this respect, meaning women earn about 60–70% of what men earn. People say it's just, other people say it's not just. It's a kind of developing thing, and this is the important point that we are, as economists, as academics, as students, you define it, in general as human beings, we are part of this process of definition, of defining something. And I mentioned briefly the idea of a harmonious society that is here in China on the agenda. We, in many cases, refer to a society as something abstract. And we forget about this easily, that we are part of it and we are acting it. It's not only the politicians in Beijing or wherever in the province administration, it is everybody of us who has this responsibility in one or another way. I come back to something that happened the last weekend, I said. One of the reactions on this cruel event is in Norway. There is migration, and migration is a huge problem in Europe, currently especially there, but migration is as well an issue here in China, although very different. It's here more the migration from the countryside to the cities. People are moving. What Norway said, you see it there, with Facebook messages, sending Facebook messages out, they say, do not come to Norway. We will not look after you. Norway is one of the richest countries in the world. Again, what is the link to economics? Externalities, short-term orientation. The other thing is, I mentioned the economy we are building, the economic system we are establishing and of which we are part. Unfortunately, one can laugh a little bit about this, because nothing serious in it. TGV is a high-speed train, and the reason, the last sentence, you cannot read it there, the derailment was due to excessive speed, officials say. Our economy is built on excessive speed. Our economy, and with it, in consequence of it, our life, is built on this idea we want everything now. It's not just we want to be immediately there with a fast, high-speed train. It is a difficult issue. Of course, I'm not arguing against going back to the good old times, which had not been really good old times. But it is something where we have to think about the principles guiding us and the principles underlying this idea of what we do in our societies and with this in our economy. And part of it is exactly this question, is efficiency, the effective use of resources in the respect of profitability, is that the only and the most important thing? Or is there anything else? You can get very emotional about it, and I had been getting very emotional about what happened in France. As I said, I lived there for a while. I have many friends in Paris, and I have as well people who are affected in other places. When earlier this year I left the French embassy, I was kind of paralyzed. You are sitting there and you are doing your thing. You are doing your academic work, and then you see what is going on in real life. Then you are asking yourself, what am I really doing? What is the value of it? And there are kind of two answers to it. And I have two paintings, or actually one etching. It's an etching on painting from David, the intervention of the subject women. It's a long story behind it, but this is basically the end of the story. In Rome, much longer time ago than 1990. Basically that the women, as presentation of love, of emotions, of empathy, went onto the battlefield and simply said, stop. And they said it to both sides. This is why I have been hesitating, or why I do not like to see now one war, terrorism, being answered by another war. I do not think that this will bring us anywhere. The other Spanish painter, the sleep of reason produces monsters. With all empathy, with all values, with all engagement, we need as well to define what we are doing and why we are doing it. We need as well reason. Thinking in a very sober way, methodologically. Basically what you saw in this one film clip, calculating the outcome. And it is not just about calculating in terms of numbers and formulas, but it is as well about the idea of what is happening in society. What happens to people if they are your age and know I do not get a proper education, I will not get a proper job even if I get education. And with 40, with 50, I will be in the same situation as I had been at this stage. So this is the situation. There are both sides required, and this is methodology. And we will go through it actually in the second part today as well. We have to have this very sober approach, and at the same time, we have to ask every time, with whatever we do, why do we do it? Not only in terms of why do we do it now, but as well in terms of where do we want to go with it. There is now the G20 meeting in Ankara. The heads of the world economy and others meeting there and discussing the future. They are talking about measures against terrorism, and at the same time their program is a healthy economy. I'm afraid, knowing previous G20 meetings, I'm afraid that they will not see the connection between their policies, their national policies of creating externalities and the idea of that could possibly part of the explanation of terrorism. So I'm a little bit too early for the end of this issue, but I'll leave it here and then we will talk in the second session about the next steps. Thank you.